They refused to let the old woman sit, then froze when they learned her identity. The ballroom glowed with golden lights. Guests in fancy clothes laughed, sipping their drinks. Waiters moved between tables, carrying trays of food and champagne. At one of the best tables, Jake and Melissa sat, smiling and chatting. Their expensive jewelry sparkled under the lights. Then, an elderly woman approached. She walked slowly, leaning on her cane. Her back ached, her legs felt weak, but she kept a kind smile. She reached their table. "Excuse me, may I sit for a moment?" "Just to rest." Melissa barely looked up. "Sorry, these seats are taken." Eleanor's eyes moved to the empty chair. Jake smirked. "Maybe try the back row?" Eleanor sighed, turning away. Then the microphone crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the most important guest of the night." The spotlight swung toward Eleanor. Jake and Melissa froze in shock. The ballroom was grand, filled with shimmering chandeliers, soft music, and well-dressed guests. It was the kind of event where people judged each other by their wealth. At the center of it all sat Jake and Melissa. Jake, in his perfectly tailored suit, leaned back in his chair, sipping champagne. Melissa, in a shiny designer dress, scrolled through her phone, barely paying attention to the people around her. They belonged here, and to them, Eleanor did not. Eleanor Whitmore, a frail, elderly woman in her late 70s, had walked into the ballroom alone. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her hands trembled slightly as she leaned on her cane. She wasn't dressed in diamonds, but there was something about her, something graceful. But no one noticed her, until she asked for a seat. Melissa barely looked up. "Sorry, these seats are taken." Jake smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. "Maybe try the back row." Eleanor's chest tightened. The chair was empty, yet she had been turned away like she was nothing. Around her, no one stepped in. Some guests glanced at her but quickly looked away. It was easier to ignore her than to speak up. She took a slow breath and turned to walk away. And that's when the microphone crackled. A voice filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, let's welcome a very special guest." The spotlight moved, and to everyone's shock it landed on Eleanor. Jake choked on his drink. Melissa's face went pale. Why was the spotlight on her? And then the host spoke the words that made the entire room gasp. "Please welcome the woman who made all of this possible, Eleanor Whitmore." Jake's breath caught in his throat. Melissa's hand shook as she set down her glass. Eleanor, the woman they had just humiliated, wasn't just a guest. She was the reason this event even existed. The ballroom fell silent. Eleanor Whitmore, the old woman they had ignored, now stood under the bright spotlight. Melissa's breath hitched. Jake gripped his chair. All around them, guests whispered, "Eleanor Whitmore. The Eleanor Whitmore. Wait, the woman who started this entire charity." Jake and Melissa exchanged panicked glances. They had made a terrible mistake. Minutes earlier, Eleanor had arrived at the ballroom with a quiet grace. She didn't walk in with an entourage or flashy jewelry. She didn't demand attention. But after standing for too long, her legs ached. She scanned the room for an empty seat. Finally, she spotted one at a table where a young couple laughed over their wine. Taking a deep breath, she walked over. "Excuse me, may I sit here for a moment?" Melissa barely looked up from her phone. "Sorry, these seats are taken." Jake sighed dramatically. "There's plenty of space in the back." Eleanor glanced at the empty chair. It was clear they just didn't want her there. She felt the sting of rejection, but she wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time people had judged her based on her appearance, but before she could respond, someone cleared their throat behind her. The event host, a man in a crisp tuxedo holding a microphone. And then, in a voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, let's welcome a very special guest." The spotlight moved and landed on her. Jake felt his stomach drop. Melissa's face was frozen in horror. The event host stepped forward. "Tonight, we honor someone who has changed thousands of lives. A woman whose generosity built this very foundation." The guests listened in awe. A woman who has dedicated her life to helping the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. Jake and Melissa felt the room closing in. The woman they had refused a seat was the very reason they were here. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just an old woman. She was the founder of the entire charity. Melissa swallowed hard. Jake's hands felt clammy. Eleanor, the woman they had dismissed so easily, now had the power to dismiss them, and she hadn't even said a word. Not yet, but she would, and they weren't ready for it. The ballroom felt different now. Eleanor Whitmore, once ignored, now stood in the center of attention. Jake and Melissa, who had refused her a seat, now sat frozen, their faces pale. The event host, standing beside Eleanor, smiled warmly. "Eleanor, please join us at the front table." A waiter rushed forward, pulling out a chair. The same chair that Jake and Melissa had denied her. But Eleanor didn't move. Instead, she turned. Her eyes landed on Jake and Melissa. The room held its breath. Minutes ago, Jake had been enjoying his night. Everything had been perfect. The drinks, the luxury, the people, until the old woman showed up. He had dismissed her without a second thought. She didn't belong at their table. But now, she was the most important person in the room. Jake's pulse pounded. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor had every reason to shame them, to call them out, to make them feel as small as they had made her feel. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled. And then, in a voice soft yet powerful, she said, "I wonder." Eleanor glanced at the guests. How many others were treated the way I was tonight? The room fell into silence. She let the question sink in. Eyes darted nervously. Because deep down, they knew the answer. Melissa's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but what could she say? "I'm sorry?" Would that even matter now? Jake clenched his jaw, his confidence gone. Eleanor wasn't just anyone. She was the Eleanor Whitmore, the founder of the very charity they had come to support. The woman whose generosity had built hospitals, funded schools, and changed thousands of lives. And they had treated her like she was nothing. Melissa opened her mouth, but Eleanor spoke first. "You assumed I wasn't worth your time." Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words crushed them. Jake's hands curled into fists under the table. Melissa looked down, her cheeks burning. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss. And now they were the ones being dismissed. Eleanor sighed, her expression gentle. "The way you treat people says more about you than it does about them." Her eyes swept across the room. "I was never angry about the chair. It was never about that." Jake and Melissa stared at her, speechless. It was about kindness. Eleanor took a step forward. "Something money can't buy." The words hit like a wave. Melissa bit her lip, her hands shaking. Jake looked away, his face tense. The entire room seemed different now. People who had ignored Eleanor earlier now felt ashamed. Eleanor turned to the event host and smiled. "I would love to sit." But then, she did something no one expected. Instead of sitting at the front table, she walked toward a small table at the back, where a young waiter stood, the only person who had smiled at her when she walked in. She sat down. "May I sit here?" she asked. The young waiter's eyes widened. "Of course, ma'am," he said, pulling out the chair. The room watched in stunned silence. Eleanor had just proven her point. It was never about status. It was about character. Jake and Melissa? They were left sitting at their expensive table, humiliated, and no one cared about them anymore. The ballroom was silent. Eleanor Whitmore had just done the unthinkable. Instead of sitting at the prestigious front table, She had chosen a simple seat at the back, next to a young waiter. The very people who had ignored her were now watching her in disbelief. Jake's jaw tightened. Melissa gripped her napkin, her fingers shaking. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. They had come to show off, to be seen with the elite. But now, all eyes were on Eleanor. And Jake and Melissa? They were invisible. Eleanor picked up a simple glass of water, taking a slow sip. Then she finally spoke. Tonight was never about money or status. She placed the glass down, looking around the room. It was about something much greater. Character. The guests shifted in their seats. Some looked ashamed, because deep down they knew. They had all treated her like she was nothing. Eleanor turned toward the young waiter. "You were the only one who showed kindness tonight." His eyes widened. Me?" he stuttered. Eleanor smiled. "Yes, you." She lifted her microphone, speaking to the entire ballroom. "True kindness is shown when you think no one is watching." Jake felt his face burn, because he had been watching, and he had done nothing. Melissa couldn't take it anymore. She shot up from her chair, forcing a smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, I just want to say, we are so honored to have you here tonight." Jake nodded quickly, trying to regain control. "It was just a misunderstanding, you see. We, didn't recognize you." Eleanor turned to them, her eyes calm. Would it have made a difference? Jake's throat went dry. Melissa froze, because they both knew the answer. If they had known who she was, they would have treated her differently. But that was the whole point. Eleanor stood, her hands folded in front of her. "I hope tonight teaches everyone something." Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. Jake and Melissa lowered their heads. They had learned the lesson too late. The event host cleared his throat. "Before we continue, we have a special announcement." Eleanor turned toward him, surprised. She hadn't planned anything more. The host smiled. "Mrs. Whitmore has given so much to the world. Tonight, we want to give something back." He gestured toward the young waiter. "Eleanor has inspired us to start a new scholarship fund, and the first recipient will be someone who showed true kindness tonight. This young man right here." The crowd erupted in applause. The waiter's mouth dropped open. Me!" Eleanor's eyes softened. "Yes, you. Kindness deserves to be rewarded." Jake and Melissa? They sat in stunned silence. Tonight, they had come seeking recognition. But the only people being celebrated were the ones who had shown kindness, and they weren't part of that list. The applause filled the grand ballroom. The young waiter stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "A scholarship? For me?" Eleanor nodded, smiling. "Yes, you showed kindness when no one else did." His hands trembled as he wiped his eyes. "I never expected anything in return." Eleanor's smile widened. "And that is exactly why you deserve it." The guests watched in silence. This was supposed to be a night for the wealthy, but instead the spotlight now shined on a humble waiter. And Eleanor had made sure of that. Melissa gripped her napkin, her breath shallow. She had spent thousands on her dress, on her jewelry, on this event. And yet, she was invisible now. Jake sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. He had always believed money was power. But tonight, an old woman with nothing to prove had taken all of it away from them. And the worst part, she hadn't done it with insults or revenge. She had done it with grace. Eleanor turned toward the guests. She spoke clearly, calmly, but her words hit like thunder. "Wealth fades, looks fade. But the way you treat people, that stays forever." The ballroom was silent, because every single person in that room knew that they had judged her too. Eleanor continued, her voice gentle but firm. "A simple act of kindness can change someone's life. And a simple act of cruelty, that can be remembered forever too." Jake and Melissa lowered their heads. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because they knew. Tonight, they had all been exposed. Eleanor turned to the event host. "I've had my moment here. Now, I'd like to leave." The host frowned. "You don't want to stay?" She shook her head. "I have nothing left to prove." She looked back at Jake and Melissa. They had expected a long speech, maybe even a lecture. But Eleanor simply gave them a knowing smile. That was worse, because she didn't have to punish them. They would never forget this night. And that was enough. Eleanor slowly stood, adjusting her cane. The waiter rushed to help her, and as she walked toward the exit, something incredible happened. One by one, guests stood. Not because they were told to, but because they respected her now. Jake and Melissa, they remained seated, because for the first time in their lives they weren't important anymore. And that was the real punishment. Eleanor walked through the doors, leaving behind a lesson that no one in that room would ever forget. They refused to let the old woman sit, then froze when they learned her identity. But Eleanor Whitmore didn't need revenge. She didn't need to humiliate anyone. Instead, she let her kindness speak for itself. And in the end, the ones who dismissed her were left forgotten. The ones who showed kindness were rewarded. Tonight wasn't just about an event. It was a lesson. True wealth isn't in money. It's in the way you treat people. So now, let's ask you, have you ever seen someone treated unfairly because of how they looked? What would you have done in Eleanor's place? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more powerful, eye-opening stories like this, hit that subscribe button now. Thank you for watching, and remember, respect costs nothing, but means everything. Until next time.